My first question is, FHIR is slowly gaining momentum, and we may still be several years away from where it's truly ubiquitous across the industry. For the digital health builders that we have on today that have not taken up FHIR yet, why should they do it now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like any standard, FHIR is going to go through a pretty similar life cycle, and that life cycle is introduction of the standard, growth of the standard, maturity of the standard, and then eventually a decline in the standard and a new standard happening. And the interesting thing about like where we're at in that life cycle is I think we're like really in the nascent stages of the growth part of the standard, which is exciting. And you're starting to see that standard become entrenched in legislation. You're seeing it adopted by healthcare organizations and EHR vendors. You're seeing payers jump into it. You're seeing the cloud vendors jump into it. So there's this really interesting like momentum being built. And I think we're kind of early in that growth part of the life cycle. And so why now is like, if you don't get on board now, you might get run over a little later. I think foundationally we've seen the specs start to deliver some immediate value in the synchronous retrieval of data, and so there's good coverage and definition and normative content around clinical concepts. There's been expansion into financial concepts, and I think now you're starting to see the standard go, okay, we've got most of that covered. We're on our fourth iteration of the standard. Like, let's start pivoting to some of the fairly ubiquitous or niche or difficult things. And you're starting to see implementation guides come out for really complicated areas like oncology, genomics, precision medicine, and other like fairly detailed, very heavy structure oriented like healthcare data concepts. And so I think that's kind of an interesting pivot point. When you see the growth, you see it's like, okay, we've got the core covered. Now let's move on to some of the harder problems that maybe haven't been easily done in previous standards. So I think that's interesting. And then I think, the other thing that's interesting about why now is I think, there's a lot of healthcare interactions that need to happen in interoperability where, I'm triggered or something happens and I need to be notified right then. And up until recently, there hasn't really been a kind of a subscriptions pub sub style framework for FHIR to kind of trigger those to then go enable a query. And I think with the release of the R4B standard and some of the work that we are doing here at Redox, you're going to start to see that ability to combine a nudged action that took place somewhere else into, okay, I'm going to go now deliver the rest of the action and the rest of the workflow through the power of the normative resources that are available. So I think the why now question, thinking back to some of my experience prior to Redox, I met with a lot of healthcare organizations, obviously working in Cerner, and I really would go to some IT staffs and they would say, if a healthcare vendor shows up and they tell us they want to add our 176th ADT interface, we're going to say, why can't you pull the data via our FHIR APIs? Like Cerner has a big arsenal, like, it's overhead personnel and maintenance time for us to manage all that. And if we can connect through a modern cloud-oriented and delivered RESTful API interaction, that can take some of the burden. So I think the why now is you're going to start to see more and more health institutions get comfortable with it as a language, as a process. And whenever they realize like how it'll shift the impacts on what it means from a resource and a delivery and a timeline perspective, I think you'll start to see conversations where you show up and you say, hey, I would love for you to buy my healthcare integration asset. And they go, cool, how long is your implementation timeline? And your response will be, well, it's FHIR-based, we can do it in 6 weeks. And somebody else who's selling that same or similar solution will have older protocol mechanisms, flat files, things like that they'll say, oh, well, it'll be 6 months. I think if I was the healthcare organization, I know who I would pick and buy in terms of impact to my org and how much personnel time I'm going to devote to it. And then how fast can I achieve ROI on what I've actually bought. So I think those are a couple of factors to consider when we talk about why FHIR and why now. Like why is this a good time to start really becoming interested in the standard and what it will do?
Awesome. So it sounds like the main risk here is really kind of from a sales perspective at this time. Is that right? Any other risks of not moving forward with FHIR?
Yeah, I think we're focusing a lot on the positives, and I want to make sure that I'm like representative. Like the healthcare V2 standard has served us very well since 1989, right? And there's a lot of things that we can do and extend to it. And honestly, I think, from a technology perspective, modern application developers would like to work with cloud-based hosted RESTful API interactions and building a layer of parsing, pipe delimited files or flat files and scrubbing all that on a batch basis is just not not I'll call it the holy grail of what you're trying to do when you're trying to advance your technology platform. I think a lot of folks also would like to spend time on their product and not spend time on integration. And so the faster, easier, more repeatable that you can interact with the standard, the more time you're focusing on creating value for whoever's consuming your interaction. I think that's a really important value prop as well, in addition to the sales implications.